I'll begin with a quote actually from a small novel by Milan Kundera called Slowness. And it's the very first few pages he says, "Ah, where have they gone, the ambulers of yesteryear? Where have they gone, those loafing heroes of folk song? Those vagabonds who roam from one mill to another and bed down under the stars? Have they vanished along with footpaths, with clearings, with grasslands, with nature?" In this small introduction, I present the idea of the Argonaut of modernism, or more broadly speaking, the loafer, as a subtle, subversive political gesture, and also a powerful form of poetic vision. Firstly, I'll point out some characteristics of the loafer for the 20th century and beyond. And second, I'll turn to a case study, the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa, who I think is a good example of a certain kind of loafer. There's lots of examples we can take, but today I'm going to, as I said, look at the first part, the loafer as a poetic vision and as a kind of form of rebellion, and also Fernando Pessoa. When I'm talking about loafer, we think idler, rambler, the champion of indolence, the stargazer and the daydreamer. Notices across the United States, when I go and visit, can be found on public walls, supermarkets, and even public spaces that say, "Notice no loafing or loitering in this area." And this is just an example of a photograph that I took here that you can see across the States. So loafing is not something that we should be doing these days. Stop loafing, get a job, you know. So we don't want to be seen to be lazy or idle or doing nothing, God forbid, in this capitalist society of speed, traffic, material want, and chatter. The loafer in philosophy and literature is actually a critical stance who goes against the tide of his or her time, while at the same time, paradoxically, stands up for and celebrates an unlikely hero for a century of contradictions. Hopefully this will be made more clear as I go on. As the industrial age takes off in the 19th century, the great exporters of capitalism, the United States, paradoxically has its two icons, loafers. You have Walt Whitman, the great and most famous probably poet of the idea of the United States, who begins his Leaves of Grass with the line, "I loaf and I invite my soul." I have a third image here of Walt Whitman, the great American poet. And this is, you know, with the bowler hat, looking quite disheveled, and yet he represents for many the idea of the United States. The second of the loafers is Herman Melville, who wrote probably the United States' most famous novel, Moby Dick, which begins with a man being idle, wandering the streets, contemplating, actually contemplating killing himself, looking at the coffins go by, and idleness leads him to jump on a boat called Piquoid and hunt down the elusive whale. In science, loafing also seems to have crept in. The fable of Isaac Newton loafing under a tree, an apple falling on his head, which leads him with the eureka idea of the theory of gravity. Or even Einstein, who can only really get his work done once he gets a job in the patent office. And that's where he writes his most famous and revolutionary papers, The Theory of Relativity. This is all, by the way, a very serious joke. The idea of the loafer is always an ironic stance. So this is a very important thing, and we'll see as we go on a little bit. Philosophy itself, also the beginning of the 20th century philosophy, mid-19th century philosophy, in a way that the two most innovative and influential thinkers in at least European philosophy, alongside Marx, are Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche, who are so influential for many movements in the 20th century, including phenomenology, existentialism, deconstruction, there's many different things, even psychoanalysis as well. And both of them strike the pose, idlers and loafers. Kierkegaard takes the stance of loafer, and he calls himself a dagdriver, the Danish word dagdriver, which literally means day drifter. Other times he calls himself an extra skriver, which means extra writer, and talks about writing books that are useless, that have no value. And he says at one point, under the guise of Johannes Clinicus, because he always writes under pseudonyms, of which he has more than 30, he says, you know, I smoke and I light my cigar, I loaf and I write, I loaf and I write, and I wonder, and I realize I have nothing to say. And as the times have become so easy, it's My only job now is to try to make things more difficult, because everything is so easy. And so he begins, and he writes a book. It's over 600 pages long, called The Concluding Unscientific Postscript to the Philosophical Fragments. Of course, if you don't get the joke, then you're missing out. Of course, it's a very serious joke, where he talks about the idea of uselessness, but actually he's trying to regain the things that are most important to us. And Nietzsche, of course, this Nietzsche that we always see as this revolutionary, very serious thinker, is probably one of the most humorous philosophers around. And in the Twilight of the Idols, he begins, idleness is the beginning of all psychology. And he wants to consider himself a psychology. It's idleness that leads him to great thoughts. So the greatest writers and poets, in many ways, have celebrated the loafer in the most hectic, inventive, rapidly changing and destructive century we've yet to experience. Loafing might be one of the last surviving means of resistance to the encroachments of the technological system and information age that convinces most of us to purchase things we don't need, buy cars, to be stuck in traffic jams in cities that have the most sophisticated transport systems around, glue ourselves to online social media to keep in touch with people that we couldn't or wouldn't keep in touch with otherwise, and start getting angry with having to wait an extra 3 minutes for a coffee or a train because we might be late for work, which we actually don't even enjoy. Adorno once said, today we should have to add, it is part of morality not to be at home in one's home. Of course, he wrote this in 1946 when most of Europe was in rubble. I was talking to a friend last night, and we remembered that children's story, the never-ending story. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it has a vital message, actually, in that the planet of Fantasia in this film is dying and being consumed by the nothing, because people of Earth no longer dream and have lost their hope. So when people of the Earth no longer dream, Fantasia, which has no boundaries, because Fantasia is the imagination, so that starts to shrink once the people of the Earth, or our Earth, start not to dream, and they have no hope. And people who have no hope are far easier to control. Fernando Pessoa, at the age of 4 or 5, he was already creating what he went on to call heteronyms. These are, he said, they were more than pseudonyms. Heteronyms were creating other personalities, such as, and he has over 100 of them, by the way. They keep discovering more and more of these heteronyms. Kind of sophisticated pseudonyms who have a biography, who have a date of birth, who have feelings. In some ways, he says, they have more feelings than I could ever possibly have. Like all good writers, after about 6 months in university, he realized he cannot learn much there and starts writing himself. There's 4 particular, and I haven't even gone on to the word Argonaut yet, there's 4 particular heteronyms that are worth looking out for. Of course, he has many, but there's 4 that he really have got a large body of work. The first is Alberto Caeiro, who is the kind of a Walt Whitman style figure. Of course, Fernando Pessoa was very much fascinated by and influenced by Walt Whitman. His early odes show that. Caeiro represents the kind of figure out in the wilderness, who lives on top of a hill, who says, his first line, his first poem is, I've never kept sheep, but it's as if I had. So he's this abstract shepherd, who says at another point, I am the size of what I see, and not the size of my height. So when you think of the traveller's eye, he's a figure who, you are the size of what you see. So again, this is it's the hint to the imagination. Alberto Caeiro, who writes very simple poetry, very simple Portuguese as well, and dies young of TB. Of course, he never existed. And writes, it's very different, and very positive, affirmative poet. Then you have Álvaro de Campos, who is a follower of Alberto Caeiro, who is in many ways the opposite. Neurotic, restless, constantly on the move, travels around the world, writes these messy, kind of operatic odes, and never really finds peace, and tries to be a flat air, wears a monocle, and prances around Lisbon, tries to study engineering in Scotland, doesn't get far in that, and comes back. He's the most prolific of the poets. And you have the third one, Ricardo Reis, again, who is different again, who emigrates to Brazil as a monarchist, and as a doctor, writes very sophisticated Portuguese. As Fernando Pessoa says, he writes far better Portuguese than I do. And it's very old, stoical, kind of written in the kind of form of Horatian odes, also with nothing much to do. So these 3 are figures, one from the north, one from the centre, and one from the south of Portugal. And I haven't even gone into the etymology of the names, Reis being kings, Caeiro like meat without the meat, carnero, and Campos meaning from the countryside, Álvaro de Campos. So there's a lot to take in there. The fourth of these four is Bernardo Soares, who's the author of Fernando Pessoa's kind of great unfinished prose work, the Book of Disquiet. And he is one who was a small little bookkeeper living on the Rua dos Storadores, which literally means the road of the street of the gold makers. It's a small, narrow street in the centre of lower Lisbon, of which the sun never really gets in. You can't really see the end of the street either. It looks like it's going out into infinity, and nothing much ever really happens. But of course, the name of the street maybe hints at a former glory or some secret power, gold makers. And he lives and works on that street, and nothing really much happens in this large, unfinished book. But of course, everything happens because he is a traveller of the imagination, and he creates multi-universes in this journey he makes, walking the streets of this lower part of Lisbon. The Argonaut, of course, is something from the Greeks, Jason and the Argonauts, and it's something that picks up again this idea in the 16th century, this kind of the high point or the glory time for when Portugal for a moment was at the centre of world affairs, when it was the first to go out and discover these other areas that Europeans had never been to before. And they had a term, navigare preciso, vivere naue preciso, which literally means to sail is necessary, to live is not. And this was the mantra of the Argonauts in ancient times. And Pompey, this is documented in Plutarch's biographies of Pompey, when Pompey says, navigare preciso, he says it in Latin, of course, navigare preciso, vivere naue preciso, when the ship is about to sink. It's better to sail than it is to live, to keep going. So in the 16th century, happens in the late 15th century from Vasco da Gama, Magellan, Cabral, the discoverer of Brazil, Bartholomew Diaz, all these Portuguese explorers. This is the idea of navigare preciso, vivere naue preciso, this very exciting time. And the two most famous poets or writers of that time is Camões, who was the great kind of epic poet of that time, who wrote the Os Lusíadas. It's the great Portuguese epic. And he's a figure who had to leave Lisbon because he was having an affair with some woman, lost his eye in battle, got shipwrecked numerous times, and wrote this big epic. And these are a time when poets were real heavyweight figures. And then you have Fernão Mendes Pinto, who wrote this massive 800-page book called The Peregrinations, about his journeys and travels through the Orient, through Japan, through India, China, probably lied through his teeth through many of the adventures. But it doesn't matter because it's pure adventure for a reader. So this is the kind of thing that children in school still read, Fernando Mendes Pinto's kind of cartoon versions of the great adventures of these figures in the 16th century. In the Book of Disquiet, he says, what I'm going to do is to go interior. There's only one place left to go. Now that we have this sort of bankrupt, defeated landscape for the last 400 years, and if any of you go to Portugal, there's a pessimism and melancholy there, saudade being the most operative word, which they're quite proud of. But Pessoa turns that into an art form, where he turns the Argonaut and the idea of loafing right in on itself in the Book of Disquiet. And that passage in paragraph 125, he talks about how he has to delve deep into the abysses of the self. And what he does is, of course, trying to find that self, he creates a multiplicity, a plurality of selves, always interchanging. As a final point, I'd like to also think, when you think of these loafers, you said that the incognito, or the set of masks, there's also the idea of the spy that they talk about. Kierkegaard calls himself a spy, somehow going undercover and looking at it. And Pessoa likes to say, I like to other myself all the time into something else and see with new eyes. The speech by King Lear to Cordelia before they are taken away, he says, and so we'll live and pray and sing and tell old tales and laugh at gilded butterflies and take upon us the mystery of things as if we are God's spies. And I think there's a lot in that passage, but if we think of that passage in the context of talking about the loafer, we'll live and pray and sing and tell old tales. To pray, and poetry here is a form of redemption, and to tell old tales, to tell the fable again and again, stories, and turn figures, motifs. These are very vital. And laugh at gilded butterflies. Laugh at the ones that are all, the mode of today. But, learn to be able to laugh. And Nietzsche says that as well. The higher man must learn to laugh. Kierkegaard, the philosopher that has no humour, is no longer a philosopher. And to be as if we are God's spies. Not saying we are God's spies, but as if we are God's spies. The conclusion, I guess, is that when we think of windows, no longer is it a mirror but a window. Because at the end of Milan Kundera's speech, the way I began this talk about where have they gone, the loafing heroes of folk song, he says underneath that, where have they gone? Perhaps, as the Czech proverb says, they are gazing through God's windows. Again, when you think of God here, think of the imagination. So they're gazing through God's windows. Again, we have this idea of somehow the spy of God, gazing through God's windows. With the imagination and travel, things are possible. We're always standing on a threshold between 2 points, because a traveller is always going between 2 points. It's on the way somewhere, at an interval of things. There's always a dying land behind us and an ocean ahead of us. Thank you very much.